Imagine standing at the edge of a blood-soaked field, damp with morning fog and heavy with the stench of sweat, mud, and fear. Two armored figures face each other in grim silence. They are not warriors by choice, at least not always, but participants in a deadly spectacle born from honor, law, and vengeance. Their lives now hinge on a brutal game with no referee, no second chances, and no room for weakness. This is no knightly duel of chivalric poetry. This is a medieval trial by combat, and only one man walks away. In the Middle Ages, disputes didn't always end in courtrooms with scribes and verdicts. Sometimes, they ended with steel and blood. If a man was accused of theft, adultery, betrayal, or even murder, and no clear evidence could convict or clear him, he could demand a trial by combat. It was believed that God would grant victory to the righteous, and so the blade would speak where law failed. That belief, twisted as it was, sent countless men to their graves. The challenge was issued in public, often shouted before witnesses, sealed with insults, and backed by witnesses ready to testify to one's character. Nobles dueled to protect their name. Peasants did it for survival. Sometimes a land dispute, a dishonor to one's sister, or even whispered rumors could trigger a death match. Refusal to accept a duel could mean forfeiting your rights, or worse, admitting guilt by silence. Once the date was set, the ritual began. The combatants fasted, prayed, and prepared for what might be their final day on earth. Armorers hammered out suits of mail. Weapons were selected. Sometimes swords, sometimes clubs, axes, or even war hammers. There was no standard. It depended on the region, the social status of the fighters, and the customs of the court. Some duels were held on raised wooden platforms, others in open fields or specially dug pits. Crowds gathered early. Nobles arrived dressed in furs. Clergy offered blessings, and beggars waited on the outskirts, hoping to loot the corpse of the loser. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Each man stepped forward, sometimes swearing an oath of innocence, other times calling on God's wrath to strike down the liar before him. There were no cheers, no fanfare, only grim expectation. When the duel began, the glamour disappeared. These weren't choreographed dances of blade and step. They were savage, clumsy, exhausting fights. Sword met shield, mace crushed helmet, blood sprayed across hay-strewn grounds. Every strike could be the last. Some duels ended in seconds, a clean thrust through a joint in the armor. Others dragged on for hours, both men collapsing from exhaustion before one found the strength to finish it. If a man yielded, he was often executed. Mercy wasn't always granted. The loser's lands could be taken, his name ruined, his family disgraced. But worse were those who lived, maimed, broken, their spirits shattered. Victory did not guarantee safety. It only meant survival. For some, the trauma lingered far longer than the bruises. In a rare twist, women could also demand justice through trial by combat. But in those cases, a champion fought on her behalf. A brother, a husband, a hired sword. Once, in 1386, a famous duel unfolded in France between Jean de Carouges and Jacques Legris over the alleged rape of Carouges' wife. It was sanctioned by the king. Thousands watched. When Carouges drove his dagger into Legris' throat, the crowd erupted. His wife wept, vindicated, alive, and free only because of blood spilled on a frozen field. But while nobles fought with steel, were the common folk. What happened when a peasant broke his leg in the field or suffered a fever? Medieval healing was an entirely different kind of gamble, one that balanced on the edge of superstition and desperation. Villages had no hospitals, no sterile tools, and no true doctors. Instead, they turned to wise women, traveling herbalists or local healers who passed knowledge by word of mouth. Illness wasn't seen as a virus or bacteria. It was punishment, divine or demonic. A man with epilepsy was believed to be possessed. A child with boils might be blamed on a curse or an evil glance. Healing began not with medicine, but with prayer and ritual. Warts were rubbed with slugs or raw meat, then buried at a crossroads under moonlight. Headaches were chased away by wrapping a dead mole around the neck. Toothaches? A touch of holy relics or chewing henbane, poisonous, of course, was thought to help. The danger was constant. Even simple injuries could fester and kill. An infected cut might result in amputation, done with a dull blade and no anesthesia, followed by wine poured into the wound. Some treatments worked, not by science, but luck. Honey, used on wounds, had antibacterial properties. Moldy bread, unintentionally a form of penicillin, sometimes helped, but it was never certain. And every visit to a healer could be your last. Worse still with the charms. One village believed tying a live frog around a child's neck would cure whooping cough. Others burned hair and made the sick inhale the smoke. Cures often involved bloodletting, draining the patient of what was thought to be bad humors. It rarely helped. Many grew weaker, died faster, but they believed. That belief gave them comfort. In an age where life was nasty, brutish, and short, hope came in forms both beautiful and bizarre. Superstition was a thread woven into the very fabric of daily life. If a man recovered, the charm worked. If he died, it was God's will. Either way, no one questioned the healer. They were both feared and revered. And so, the same people who cheered at a noble's duel knelt beside their own sick child, chanting words they didn't understand, trusting that maybe, just maybe, the old woman in the corner knew what she was doing. These were lives lived under constant threat. War, plague, famine, and disease. But amidst all that, there was love, loyalty, laughter, and a desperate will to survive. In the next chapter, we'll meet the haunting figure whose mask still sends chills down spine centuries later. The plague doctor. With his beaked face and long robes, he was the last visitor many would ever see. But was he a healer, a fraud, or a ghost of death itself? Stay with us, because the story only gets darker from here. A dark figure moves slowly through the cobbled streets, cloaked in black, gloved from finger to elbow, and crowned with masks that looked like the beak of a monstrous bird. Children hid behind doors. Dogs howled. People whispered prayers under their breath. But no one dared stop him, because when the plague doctor arrived, it usually meant someone in your house was about to die. The beaked mask wasn't just for show. Stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs, garlic, lavender, and even crushed rose petals, the mask was designed to protect the doctor from what they believed was the cause of plague. Poison air. They called it miasma. Invisible, corrupt fumes that floated through the city, seeping into your lungs, making you rot from the inside. They didn't know about germs or bacteria. To them, bad smells equaled disease, and sweet scents were the cure. These men were hired by towns when the Black Death struck. Some were trained physicians, but many weren't. Some were bankrupt barbers, failed scholars, or even grifters looking to make a quick coin. But they wore the uniform all the same, a long wax coat, wide-brimmed hat, leather gloves, and a staff to poke and prod without touching. The staff wasn't just practical. It also helped beat back desperate crowds. Because when people saw death closing in, they didn't always beg. Sometimes they attacked. Plague doctors didn't treat patients the way you might think. They were record keepers, death counters, witnesses to horror. Their job was to log the number of infected, seal off homes, sometimes perform autopsies, and recommend basic treatment. But there was little they could do. They might lance a boil, drain pus, or prescribe vinegar-soaked cloth to wear over the face. Sometimes they offered dried toad or powdered emerald. Most of it didn't work. Some of it made things worse. And many patients died faster after treatment. But in a world collapsing under the weight of the dead, people took whatever help they could get. Mass graves swallowed thousands. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Rats crawled freely in abandoned kitchens. Mothers wailed in corners beside lifeless children. Churches overflowed with prayers that went unanswered. And the doctor kept walking one slow step at a time. Some tried to do good. They risked their lives, entered infected homes, comforted the dying, even if they knew they couldn't save them. But others turned cruel. They demanded high pay and refused to treat the poor. Some blackmailed families. One doctor in Italy was caught stealing from corpses. In the chaos of plague, even the mask couldn't hide corruption. Despite the myths, plague doctors weren't common everywhere. Many countries had none. Others had just a few. Their image became more popular after the worst of the plague had passed. But their memory remains burned into history, not just for what they wore, but for what they represented. the terrifying uncertainty of death. They weren't saviors. They were omens. Still, they are remembered because they faced a storm when most ran from it. Whether out of greed, duty, or madness, they stepped into the heart of despair. And centuries later, we still see their ghostly shape haunting our imagination. And in that same world, one woman rose above fear, betrayal, and even kings themselves. A woman born into power, but forced to fight for her place in history. Her name was Isabella of France, and they would one day call her the She-Wolf. Isabella's story begins with her birth in 1295 to Philip IV, the powerful and ruthless king of France. From childhood, she was trained to be more than a daughter. She was a diplomatic tool. At just 12, she was married off to Edward II of England to unite two crowns. But what should have been a royal partnership became a storm of humiliation, secrets, and rebellion. Edward II had no interest in her. His heart belonged to his male favorite, Piers Gaveston. Isabella arrived in England to find herself sidelined, her position mocked, her husband ignoring her for a man many thought unworthy of the crown. She watched as Gaveston was showered with titles and wealth. Even her royal dowry was neglected, but she smiled through the insults. She observed. She waited. Eventually, the English nobles had enough. Gaveston was captured and executed by rivals. For a brief time, Isabella had peace. She gave birth to a son, Edward III, and hoped her marriage might finally turn. But it didn't last. Another favorite emerged, Hugh Despenser the Younger, even more hated, even more greedy. And again, Isabella was pushed into the shadows. But this time, she didn't accept it. When tensions between England and France flared, Isabella convinced Edward to let her travel to France to negotiate peace. But once in her homeland, she refused to return. She made an open alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English noble who had fled into exile after opposing the Despensers. Their partnership wasn't just political. They became lovers. And together, they planned a coup. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small army. What followed was stunning. The people welcomed her. Nobles rallied behind her. Cities opened their gates. Edward II, betrayed and surrounded, was captured. The Despensers were hunted down and executed in horrifying fashion. One was hanged, drawn, and quartered in public. His entrails burned before him. With Edward II imprisoned, Isabella ruled as regent for her young son. She had triumphed. For the first time in English history, a queen had deposed a king. But power, once taken, is never easily shared. Mortimer grew arrogant. Isabella grew reckless. Their enemies regrouped in silence. At 17, Edward III struck back. With a band of loyal men, he stormed into Mortimer's chambers and arrested him. Mortimer was executed as a traitor. Isabella was spared but stripped of power. She spent the rest of her life in quiet confinement, though never fully imprisoned. She lived in comfort, surrounded by servants, visited by her son, remembered by history as both a victim and a villain. Was she a wronged queen who sought justice, or a cunning manipulator who craved power? The answer lies somewhere in between. But one thing is certain, Isabella was no passive figure. In a world ruled by men, she carved her own path, even if it was soaked in scandal and betrayal. And this, ultimately, is the world we've explored. A world where duels were fought, not just for survival, but for justice. Where healing was done with whispered charms and crushed herbs. Where death wore a mask and walked among the people. And where even a woman born in chains could rise to shake a throne. The Middle Ages were not simple. They were violent and strange, beautiful and terrifying. Behind every sword, every superstition, every silent plague doctor, and every powerful queen, there was a story deeper than what the chronicles wrote. A story not just of history, but of humanity,